He walked out without warning, trading years of marriage for someone younger, only for Claire to discover that someone was her closest friend. The betrayal ran deeper than the affair, twisting memories, rewriting trust, and leaving her to rebuild from the ashes of two relationships she thought would last forever. But Claire didn't break. She watched, listened, and uncovered every hidden truth, not to destroy them, but to make sure she would never be blindsided again. This is the story of what happens when the people you trust most become the ones who cut the deepest, and how one woman chose strength over revenge. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The soft hum of conversation mixed with the faint clink of cutlery against porcelain filled the small Italian restaurant. Warm light from low-hanging lamps bathed the room in a golden glow, catching the glasses of red wine and the polished surfaces of the tables. Claire had always loved this place, not because it was fancy, but because it felt like theirs. The waitstaff knew them by name. The pasta was always fresh, and there was a small corner table by the window that Daniel insisted was the best in the house. They had claimed it again tonight, but the warmth that usually came with these evenings was noticeably absent. She noticed it before the bread basket even arrived. Daniel's eyes kept shifting toward the entrance, scanning every person who walked in as if expecting someone. His phone, normally face down and forgotten during dinner, lay beside his plate like an extra guest. Every time it vibrated, he snatched it up quickly, tapping the screen before she could catch a glimpse. Claire tried to ignore it at first, telling herself he was probably dealing with some work emergency. But it was Friday night, and Daniel rarely brought work into their evenings. She watched him cut into his ravioli without really tasting it, his fork moving on autopilot. The half-hearted nods and murmured responses to her attempts at conversation made her feel as though she were speaking into an empty room. When the waiter came to refill their water glasses, Daniel glanced over the man's shoulder toward the door again. This time, Claire followed his gaze, seeing nothing but a couple shrugging off their coats and a family wrangling a restless child. She sipped her wine slowly, trying to mask the tightening in her chest. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone light, but her eyes fixed on him. He looked up, startled, as though he'd forgotten she was sitting there. Yeah, of course," he said too quickly, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just got a lot on my mind." "Work," she pressed gently. He hesitated for half a beat too long. "Yeah, work." Claire nodded, pretending to accept the answer, but her mind began cataloging every detail. The restless movements, the flicker of his gaze to the entrance, the way his thumb hovered over his phone even when it wasn't vibrating. She had learned over the years to notice the small things, the tiny cracks that hinted at something beneath the surface. Their plates arrived, steaming and fragrant, and she tried to steer the conversation to safer ground. Plans for the weekend, a movie they'd talked about seeing, even a memory from their early dating days. Each topic fizzled in the space between them. He responded with short sentences, eyes darting back to the door as though it might open to reveal something more important than the woman sitting across from him. At one point, his phone buzzed again. This time he picked it up so quickly that the edge of the screen caught on the tablecloth. He typed something with his shoulders hunched, the screen tilted away from her. When he set the phone down, face down this time, he avoided meeting her gaze. Claire twirled her fork in the pasta, the creamy sauce clinging to the noodles. She took a bite she barely tasted, her appetite slipping away. She watched the way Daniel shifted in his seat, his posture taut, as though he were bracing for something. The couple in the next booth laughed, their voices carrying just enough for Claire to catch snippets of their conversation. It sounded easy, warm, how she and Daniel used to sound here. She set her fork down quietly, feeling a distance between them that the small table could no longer bridge. By the time they reached dessert, Daniel had checked his phone at least 6 times. Claire noticed the way his expression softened briefly when one particular message appeared, the corners of his mouth twitching into a smile before he quickly smoothed it away. She didn't ask, not because she didn't want to know, but because she suspected she already did. Outside, the air was cool, scented faintly with rain from earlier in the evening. As they walked to the car, Daniel stayed a step ahead of her, pulling his phone out once more under the glow of the streetlight. She could see the reflection of the screen in his glasses, and for a moment she thought she caught the outline of a name she recognized. But he slipped it back into his pocket before she could be sure. She climbed into the passenger seat, the familiar smell of his cologne filling the enclosed space, now tinged with something sharper. Anticipation, maybe, or guilt. He started the engine, and the soft strains of the radio filled the silence between them. Claire kept her eyes on the blurred streetlights passing outside her window, her thoughts already circling the unsettling truth that this dinner, meant to be a simple Friday night together, had quietly become the first night she felt like she was losing him. The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that didn't feel comfortable but heavy, like a closed door you weren't meant to open. The restaurant's warmth was gone, replaced by the dim glow of passing streetlights and the faint hum of the heater. Daniel kept both hands on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if any glance toward her might break whatever decision he had already made. Claire sat with her hands clasped in her lap, watching the way the lights traced over his profile and faded into darkness. When they pulled into the driveway, the familiar crunch of gravel under the tires felt sharper than usual, each sound echoing in her chest. The house loomed quietly against a winter night, their porch light casting a small pool of gold that did little to soften the January cold. They stepped inside, and Daniel set his keys on the table by the door, his movements brisk, almost rehearsed. Claire slipped off her coat, waiting for him to relax, to sink into their usual end-of-night routine. But instead of heading toward the living room or kitchen, he stood in the center of the hallway, his posture rigid. There was something in the way he avoided her eyes that made her stomach tighten. "Claire," he began, his voice level, almost attached. "We need to talk." She froze halfway through unbuttoning her sweater, her fingers pausing on the fabric. "Okay," she said cautiously, the single word stretching thin in the air between them. He didn't ask her to sit down, didn't offer a preamble, didn't search for gentle words. "I want a divorce." It landed with the bluntness of a door slamming in her face. No hesitation, no build-up, just a statement that seemed to strip the air from the hallway. For a moment, she didn't respond. She wasn't sure if she'd heard him correctly or if her mind had twisted the words into something that made less sense than they were meant to. "What?" Her voice was quiet, not yet trembling but close. "I've met someone else," he said, still not looking at her. The words were delivered as plainly as if he were telling her he'd changed his mind about dinner. No fight, no apology. Just a fact he had decided she needed to hear now. Claire took a slow breath, feeling the chill from outside still clinging to her skin. "You've met someone else," she repeated, the words tasting strange in her mouth. "And that's it? That's all you have to say?" His eyes flicked up to hers for the briefest moment before returning some fixed point over her shoulder. "There's nothing else to say. I don't want to fight about it. I can't do this anymore." The finality in his tone was colder than the air that had followed him inside. She searched his face for some sign of hesitation, some flicker that might tell her this was a mistake, a moment of poor judgment. There was nothing. His expression was calm, almost relieved, as though the burden of keeping this from her had weighed more than the act itself. She tried to speak, but her throat felt tight. A dozen questions fought to rise. Who, when, how long, but they tangled together and none came out. Instead, she stepped back slightly, needing space between them that the hallway didn't provide. Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out without hesitation, glancing at the screen before slipping it back. That small action, so casual, told her more than any explanation could. Whoever it was, they were the reason he was standing here, dismantling their life in less than a minute. Claire moved past him into the living room, her feet finding the path without thought. She sank onto the couch, the familiar cushions doing nothing to ease the sharpness in her chest. Daniel followed but didn't sit. He stayed by the doorway, leaning against the frame like he was already on his way out. "I'll start moving my things this weekend," he said, his voice clipped, as though logistics were the only matter left between them. She looked up at him, her hands resting limp in her lap. "Do I even get to know who it is?" He hesitated, and for a brief second, she thought he might tell her. But then he shook his head. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," she said, but he was already looking away again. They stayed like that for a moment. Her on the couch, him in the doorway, both knowing the conversation was over, even if nothing had been resolved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock and the wind brushing against the windows. Daniel finally pushed off the doorway and walked toward their bedroom. Claire sat frozen, the quiet of the house pressing in, the reality settling like frost over every surface. Somewhere down the hall, she heard the muffled sound of a drawer opening and the soft thud of something being set inside a suitcase. The night had begun with pasta and wine, the comfort of a place they had once claimed as theirs. Now, it ended with the taste of cold air and the echo of words she hadn't been prepared to hear. And though Daniel's voice had been even, almost calm, the truth behind it was unshakable. Whatever had been between them was over, and he had chosen to end it without giving her a chance to hold on. The next 2 days unfolded in a strange kind of blur, as though the walls of the house had tilted just enough to make everything feel slightly off balance. Daniel didn't speak much after that night. He didn't argue, didn't justify, didn't even attempt small talk. His presence was reduced to the sound of drawers sliding open, the dull thump of closet doors, and the quiet scrape of hangers as his clothes disappeared one by one. Claire moved around him like a guest in her own home, keeping to the edges of rooms, her hands finding busywork that didn't need doing. She wiped down kitchen counters twice in a row. She folded laundry that had already been folded. She took the dog, Oliver, for walks that stretched longer than necessary, lingering the cold just to avoid walking back into the stillness that awaited her. When she did return, she noticed how quickly the rooms were changing. His side of the closet, once crammed with suits, weekend jeans, and the occasional shirt she bought him on impulse, was now a bare stretch of wood and metal rods. The top shelf, where he kept his hats and the shoebox filled with ticket stubs from concerts and baseball games, was empty except for a faint rectangle of dust where the box had sat. He didn't ask her to help. He carried his own suitcases down the hall, the wheels bumping against the uneven floorboards, the zipper pulls clicking against the handles. The thud of each suitcase at the bottom of the stairs seemed louder than it should have been, as if the house itself was marking every trip he made toward the door. In the living room, he took the framed photos that included him but left the ones of her alone or with Oliver. He unplugged his charging station from the wall, coiled the cord neatly, and dropped into a bag without glancing up. The shelves where his books had lived, mostly biographies and scattering of old college textbooks, looked skeletal now, the gaps between Claire's remaining novels like missing teeth. She tried not to watch, but it was impossible not to notice the methodical way he worked, stripping away pieces of himself from the space they had shared. He didn't linger over anything. There was no hesitation when his hand closed around an object, no moment of deciding whether it belonged here or with him. He had already decided. Oliver followed him from room to room, nails clicking against the hardwood, tail wagging uncertainly as if trying to figure out if this was a game. When Daniel knelt to rub behind the dog's ears, Oliver leaned into his touch, unaware that this was goodbye. Claire stood in the doorway, arms folded, forcing herself to remain still until Daniel stood, gave the dog one last pat, and walked past her without making eye contact. By the second evening, there were empty spaces everywhere she looked. The bathroom counter no longer held his razor or the aftershave she'd always loved. The kitchen table had one less chair pulled out. Even the garage felt different without his battered toolbox and the shelves of cleaning supplies he insisted on organizing by type and size. When he finally carried the last suitcase to his car, he paused by the open door for a moment, as though there might be something left to say. Claire waited, standing just inside the threshold with Oliver pressed against her leg, the winter air curling around her ankles. But whatever thought had flickered through his mind, he kept it to himself. He slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and started the engine. The headlights cut across the driveway, throwing long shadows over the front yard. She watched the taillights disappear down the street until they were swallowed by the dark, leaving nothing but the low hum of the heater in the hall and the sound of Oliver shifting his weight beside her. Inside, the house felt unnervingly quiet, every sound amplified by the emptiness he'd left behind. She could hear the faint creak of the stairs when she walked up them, the hollow echo in their bedroom now that half the furniture was gone. Lying in bed that night, she stared at the ceiling, the absence beside her heavier than any presence could have been. The dog curled at her feet, offering the only warmth in a room that seemed larger, colder, and utterly unfamiliar. She knew the mortgage payment would still be due in 2 weeks. The utility bills would arrive as they always did. The life they had built here would keep moving forward, indifferent to the fact that it was now hers alone to manage. But in that moment, sitting in the quiet and listening to Oliver's slow breathing, Claire realized it wasn't just the bills or the chores she'd been left with. It was a silence, the kind that seeps into the corners and lingers long after the person who caused it is gone. The supermarket had always been one of those ordinary places for Claire, a space where the routines of life unfolded without thought. She walked the aisles with a list in hand, tossing the same brand of coffee Daniel used to prefer, the bread they'd always bought, the dog treats Oliver loved. Now, without him, the cart felt lighter, the trip shorter. But the absence didn't make the store feel any less public, any less exposed. It began subtly, so faint she almost convinced herself she imagined it. Near the produce section, 2 women she recognized from the neighborhood paused in their conversation as she approached. Their eyes flickered toward her, then away, their voices lowering to a murmur. She caught only the words younger and seen, but the way they glanced at her as they picked over the apples told her more than the words themselves. She kept walking, choosing bananas with deliberate care, pretending she hadn't noticed. But as she moved toward the dairy aisle, it happened again. A man she vaguely knew from the dog park gave her a tight, polite smile, then leaned in toward the woman beside him to say something just out of her hearing. The woman's expression shifted in that quick, unmistakable way, curiosity sliding into pity. By the time she reached the end of the aisle, Claire's chest felt tight, her hands wrapped a little too firmly around the cart handle. She tried to focus on the shelves, on the plain practicality of comparing prices for eggs, but the feeling of being watched trailed her from section to section. At the meat counter, an acquaintance from her old book club greeted her, a little too brightly. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, weather, work, the busy start of the year. But then the other woman's voice dropped, as if she were offering a kindness. "I'm so sorry to hear about you and Daniel," she said, her hand brushing Claire's arm. "I didn't want to bring it up, but people have been talking. They've seen him around with someone. She's, well, quite young." The words hung in the cool air between them, sharper than the smell of raw meat. Claire managed a small nod, murmuring something polite before excusing herself. She didn't want to ask for details. She wasn't ready to hear them. In the frozen foods aisle, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass doors, her scarf slightly askew, hair pulled back a way that had been more about getting out the door than making an impression. She studied her own face for a moment, as if searching for whatever it was that had made her replaceable in his eyes. The glass fogged slightly as the door opened beside her, breaking her stare. 2 younger women walked past, one pulling her phone from her pocket, the other whispering something that made them both laugh softly. Claire knew better than to assume it was about her, but the timing, the way they glanced back just once, was enough to make her pulse quicken. At checkout, the cashier, a teenage boy she'd seen dozens of times, avoided her eyes more than usual, his attention fixed on scanning items. The hum of idle conversation from the other lane seemed to swell around her, each fragment of laughter or half-heard comment feeding the uneasy certainty that the story of her marriage's end had traveled farther than she realized. She paid, offered a quiet thank you, and wheeled her cart toward the exit. Outside, the winter air was sharp, almost metallic, and she drew in a long breath. The parking lot stretched before her, cars glinting under the pale afternoon sun. As she loaded the bags into her trunk, she caught sight of one of the women from the produce section again, standing beside her car with a friend. Their eyes met for the briefest moment before they turned back to each other, talking in low voices. On the drive home, Claire replayed the encounters in her mind, each one weaving into a larger picture she hadn't wanted to see. The whispers were no longer just about the divorce. They were about him and whoever she was. The younger woman who now walked through town on his arm, smiling like she belonged there. At home, Oliver greeted her at the door, tail wagging, nails clicking on the floor. She set the bags down on the counter, the ordinary rhythm of unpacking groceries offering a small anchor against a swirl of thoughts. But even as she stacked the coffee on the shelf and put the eggs in the fridge, The fragments of overheard words and the careful pity in people's eyes stayed with her. It was one thing to lose him in the privacy of their home, to feel the absence in the quiet of shared spaces now emptied. It was another to realize the loss had become part of the public fabric of the town, a story told in hushed tones over produce bins and checkout counters. And though no one had said her name outright in those whispers, she could feel it threaded through every syllable, binding her to a narrative she hadn't chosen. The light had just turned red, the kind of long signal that seemed to linger in this part of town. Claire's hands rested loosely on the steering wheel, the quiet hum of the heater filling the cabin as she stared absently at the crosswalk ahead. It was late afternoon, the winter sun low enough to cast long shadows across the street, washing everything in that cold, pale light that made details stand out in sharp relief. She wasn't thinking about him in that moment. She was thinking about getting home, about letting Oliver out, about maybe making something simple for dinner. Then movement caught her eye from the corner of her vision. A pair came into view, crossing the intersection with a slow, easy stride. The man walked on the outside edge of the sidewalk, one hand tucked into the pocket of his coat, the other clasped around the fingers of the woman beside him. There was something instantly familiar in the way he moved, the measured steps, the subtle turn of his shoulders toward her as they walked. It took only a second for recognition to hit, and when it did, it was sharp enough to make her breath catch. Daniel. The sight of him out in the open, walking like this, wasn't what startled her most. It was how ordinary he looked, as though the scene belonged to him now, as though the life they'd had together had been neatly replaced. He wasn't scanning for anyone watching. He wasn't hiding, his head tilted slightly toward the woman beside him, his posture loose, comfortable. The woman was tall, dressed in the dark, fitted coat that brushed her knees, the collar turned up against the cold. A sleek leather bag rested on her shoulder, and even from a distance, Claire could tell it was expensive. Her sunglasses, oversized and framed in glossy black, hid most of her face. But there was something in her posture, in the easy swing of her stride and the faint tilt of her chin, that triggered an unwelcome sense of familiarity. The light remained red. Claire sat frozen, watching them close the distance to the next corner. The way the woman's hair, rich brown and glossy, caught the light made Claire's stomach tighten. She tried to tell herself she was imagining it, that the familiarity was just her mind making patterns where none existed. But it felt too specific, like recognizing a song from only a few notes. Daniel laughed at something the woman said, his head tipping back slightly. The sound didn't reach her through the glass, but she could picture it anyway. The faint lines that formed at the corner of his eyes, the small pause between a laugh and his next breath. She remembered that laugh in the context of dinners, movies, quiet evenings at home. Seeing it here, paired with a hand that wasn't hers, felt almost disorienting. The light clicked to green, but the car in front of her didn't move right away, forcing her to stay where she was for another moment. It gave her just enough time to see them stop at a boutique window, Daniel leaning slightly to say something as the woman adjusted her sunglasses and smiled. The movement was small, but it was there, a smile she knew, one she'd seen 100 times before across cafe tables and during late-night conversations. Claire's hands tightened around the steering wheel. A line of cars behind her began to inch forward, pulling her out of the moment. She pressed her foot to the gas, merging into the slow crawl of traffic, but her eyes flicked once more to the sidewalk in the side mirror. They were still there, still standing close, the woman's hand resting lightly on his arm. She drove on, the scene replaying itself in her mind with a clarity she wished she could erase. The coat, the hair, the way the woman carried herself, it all pressed at the edges of recognition without fully revealing its name. But the pull in her gut told her she'd seen that posture before, not just in passing, but somewhere close, somewhere personal. By the time she reached her street, the light outside had shifted toward evening. She parked in her driveway, sitting for a moment with the engine off, the faint tick of cooling metal in her ears. The familiar shape of Oliver's had appeared in the front window, his tail wagging behind the glass. She smiled faintly before stepping out into the cold, the image of Daniel and the tall brunette still threaded tightly in her thoughts. Inside, as Oliver pressed against her legs in greeting, she tried to push the picture away, but it lingered, the clasped hands, The easy laughter and the uncomfortable truth that whoever that woman was, Claire couldn't shake the feeling she already knew her. It was a little after 9 in the evening when Claire's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She was curled up in the corner of the couch with Oliver at her feet, half watching a television show she wasn't really following. The text came from Marissa, a friend she hadn't spoken to much since the separation, one of those mutual connections who had awkwardly tried to remain neutral. The message was short, only 5 words. Asterisk, thought you should see this. Asterisk, beneath it was an attached image. Claire hesitated for a moment before opening it, her thumb hovering over the screen. Something about the phrasing, the late hour, made her stomach feel oddly heavy. When the photo appeared, the feeling sharpened into something closer to nausea. Daniel stood in the center of the frame, clean-shaven, his hair swept back in the careful style he always saved for important events. He was wearing the dark tailored suit she'd once bought him for their anniversary, paired with a silk tie that caught the light. His hand rested lightly at the small of a woman's back, guiding her toward the camera as they smiled. The woman beside him was tall, elegant in a floor-length gown of deep emerald that hugged her frame. Her dark hair spilled over one shoulder in loose waves, catching the golden light of what looked like a chandelier above them. A crystal bracelet glinted at her wrist. They stood on a polished marble floor, the background blurred but still recognizable as the grand ballroom of one of the city's oldest hotels, a venue known for hosting high-profile charity galas. The image had clearly been taken by a professional photographer. The lighting was soft, flattering, every detail sharp. It was the kind of photograph meant to be seen, meant to be shared. And it had been. The corner of the screenshot revealed a caption from the event's official page, tagging both Daniel and the woman, her name hidden beneath the cut-off frame. Claire's heart gave a slow, deliberate thud in her chest. She pinched the screen to zoom in, her pulse quickening with each increment. The closer she brought the image, the clearer the small details became. The fine stitching along the edge of the suit jacket, the subtle pattern of her gown, the faint sheen of makeup on the woman's cheek. But it was a smile that made Claire stop. It wasn't just any smile. It was one she knew. The slight curve of the left corner of the mouth, the way the top lip tilted just slightly higher on one side, creating an expression that always looked on the edge of laughter. She'd seen it across countless lunches, in dimly lit cafes, over glasses of wine. She'd seen it in photos tucked into old albums and in candid shots from vacations. Her chest tightened, a cold sensation spreading from her sternum outward. She zoomed closer still, enough to see the faint line at the edge of the woman's dimple, the tilt of her chin. Recognition hovered like a shadow she didn't want to name. She told herself it could be coincidence, that plenty of women had similar features, that the angle of the photograph could be playing tricks on her. But the familiarity was too sharp, too insistent. Claire sat back against the couch, the phone still in her hand, the image frozen on the screen. Her eyes traced the way Daniel's body angled slightly toward the woman, the ease in his posture, the unguarded expression on his face. He looked comfortable, at home, like he belonged in that frame. The television murmured in the background, but she couldn't hear it anymore. She scrolled upward, looking for full caption, but the screenshot cut it off. She checked Marissa's message again, hoping for context, but there was nothing else, just the image and those 5 words. Typing felt heavy, but she sent a short reply. Asterisk, who is she? Asterisk. The 3 dots appeared for a moment, then disappeared. Seconds passed, long enough that she thought Marissa might not answer. Then the dots returned. Asterisk, not sure. She was on his arm all night. People said he introduced her as his girlfriend. Asterisk. The word sat in the message like a stone. Girlfriend. Public. Introduced. Claire stared at it until her vision blurred slightly. She told herself it didn't matter, that she already knew he'd moved on. But this was different. Seeing it captured, polished, displayed, that made it real in a way whispered rumors never could. She closed the photo, but the image remained in her mind. The ballroom lights, the way the gown's fabric seemed to catch every flicker of gold, the bracelet that sparkled when she moved. And above all, the curve of that smile, tugging at something deep and unwelcome in her memory. Oliver shifted at her feet, pressing his head against her leg as if sensing her stillness. She reached down to run her fingers over his fur, grounding herself in the simple motion. But her eyes kept drifting back to the phone on the table, the faint glow of the screen fading to black. She knew she would look at the photo again. Not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Because somewhere beneath the layers of fabric and polish, she was certain she'd find the answer to the question that had been gnawing at her since the moment she recognized that smile. Where and why, she knew her. Claire woke early the next morning with the faint residue of the photo still clinging to her thoughts. She'd fallen asleep on the couch. Oliver curled at her feet, the television long since gone dark. Now, in the pale gray of dawn, she sat with her coffee at the kitchen table. The phone beside her, its black screen reflecting the tired lines around her eyes. She told herself she wasn't going to look again, that seeing it once had been enough. But the stillness of the house and the unfinished thread in her mind made it inevitable. The image loaded slowly, the ballroom scene blooming back into color. Daniel in his dark suit, the woman in emerald beside him, smiling with that infuriating hint of familiarity. Claire's gaze drifted past expressions this time, letting her eyes search for something concrete. She traced the smooth drape of the gown, the way the fabric caught the light, the tilt of the woman's head, and then her eyes fell to the woman's wrist. A glint of silver peeked from beneath the gown's fitted sleeve, catching the camera's light at just the right angle. Claire leaned closer to the screen, her thumb and forefinger moving to zoom in. The blurred edges sharpened, and the detail came into focus. A delicate chain, silver, with a series of charms dangling in a familiar sequence. Her breath stilled. It was impossible to mistake. A miniature Eiffel Tower, a small enamel heart, a tiny key, and a seashell with a faint pearlescent sheen. She knew their weight, the way they clinked softly against one another when the wearer moved her hand. She knew because she had chosen each one, buying them over the course of months to mark milestones in someone else's life. 5 years ago, on a rainy afternoon just before her best friend Megan's birthday, Claire had given her the bracelet as a gift, the chain and its first 2 charms wrapped in a small velvet box. The other charms had come later. The Eiffel Tower after Megan's first trip to Paris, the seashell from a beach vacation they'd taken together, the heart on a Christmas when money had been tight but sentiment had been plentiful. Her pulse quickened, a slow, deliberate beat that seemed to echo in her ears. She told herself it could be a coincidence. Charm bracelets weren't rare, and plenty of people had similar combinations. But as she studied the photo, she saw the tiny scratch on the key charm, right near the loop, a mark Megan had made when it snagged on her desk drawer years ago. Claire had teased her about it, suggesting she take better care of it, and Megan had laughed, saying it made the piece feel lived in. Now it was here, on the wrist of the woman standing beside Daniel, as if it had always belonged to her. Claire set the phone down, pressing her fingertips to her temples. The familiarity she'd been trying to place for days wasn't just in the tilt of the woman's head or the curve of her smile. It was in every shared memory stitched into that bracelet, every moment she and Megan had marked together in the language of small, thoughtful gifts. Her mind began working backward, sifting through fragments, Megan's sudden unavailability in recent months, the evasive way she changed the subject whenever Daniel's name came up, the fact that she hadn't called once since the divorce. Even before that, there had been moments Claire had shrugged off, glances between the two of them during group dinners, jokes they didn't explain, an odd pause when Claire entered the room mid-conversation. The more she thought about it, the harder it was to push the possibility away. That bracelet hadn't been lost or sold. Megan would have kept it unless she'd given it to someone. And why would she do that? Claire picked up the phone again, staring at the zoomed-in image. She imagined Megan slipping her wrist through the bracelet's clasp, looking down at the charm she'd once gushed over, now worn at the side of Claire's ex-husband in a room full of strangers. The thought made her stomach turn. Oliver shifted at her feet, his nails clicking lightly on the kitchen tile. She reached down to touch him, grounding herself in the simple, steady presence. But her eyes went back to the screen once more, tracing the edge of that silver chain, the charms that no one else could have assembled in exactly that way. It wasn't proof in a legal sense, but in her bones, she knew that bracelet had been hers to give, and it had been Megan's to treasure. Now, it was an unspoken confession wrapped around another woman's wrist, gleaming under the chandelier light, while Daniel smiled beside her. The coffee had gone cold by the time Claire put the phone down again. The room felt smaller somehow, the air heavier. Whatever doubts she'd been clinging to about the woman's identity were unraveling quickly, charm by charm, until only the truth remained. She wasn't just looking at a stranger in that photo. She was looking at someone who had once sat across her kitchen table, laughing, listening, and promising, without words, to be on her side. The kitchen felt colder than usual, though the heater hummed steadily in the background. Claire sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a mug she'd stopped drinking from half an hour ago. The coffee had gone tepid, the faint ring it left on the inside of the cup marking the time she'd spent not sipping, just sitting. The bracelet, the unmistakable curve of Megan's smile, the way Daniel had looked at her in that photo, not guarded, not cautious, but comfortable, familiar. She closed her eyes and let the weight of the thought settle in. If she was right, if it really was Megan, then every conversation between them for years had a shadow she hadn't seen until now. She thought about the brunches they used to share on slow Sunday mornings, tucked into a corner booth at the little place on 5th Street. She could picture Megan leaning forward, her hair falling over one shoulder, laughing at something Claire said about Daniel forgetting to replace the milk again. Claire had thought she was confiding in a friend, sharing harmless frustrations. Now, the memory twisted in her stomach. Was Megan filing those quirks away, not just as an amused observer, but as someone taking notes? She remembered the afternoons they'd spent in her living room, glasses of wine in hand, swapping stories about work and relationships. Megan had always asked about Daniel, casually like any friend might. How's he doing? Is he still swamped with work? Did he ever fix that leaky faucet you told me about? Questions that seemed harmless then now sounded different in her head, laced with intent she hadn't considered. Her mind wandered to the night Daniel had been late coming home from a work event. She'd mentioned it to Megan the next day, rolling her eyes as she recounted how he claimed the meeting had just run over. Megan had tilted her head, smiling sympathetically, and said something like, "Men are terrible at time." Claire hadn't thought much of it then, but now she wondered if Megan had already known exactly where he'd been. The thought sent a rush of heat through her chest. The betrayal wasn't just Daniel's. It was Megan's quiet, patient weaving of herself into the very fabric of Claire's life, so close she couldn't see the seams. Every time Claire had invited her over for dinner, every game night they'd hosted with friends, every summer barbecue in the backyard, Megan had been there, sitting across from Daniel, sharing food, laughing at his jokes. Claire's fingers tightened around the mug. She could still recall Megan's voice, warm and even, on the nights Claire had called her after a fight with Daniel. Those were the conversations that cut the deepest now. She'd told Megan everything. The little hurts, the rare moments of distance, the worries she didn't share with anyone else. And Megan had listened. Her responses gentle, sometimes playful, always reassuring. Had she been comforting Claire, or quietly reassessing her own position in the story? The quiet of the kitchen seemed heavier with each memory. Oliver shifted on the floor nearby, his collar jingling softly, but even his presence couldn't break the weight pressing down on her. The realization wasn't a single sharp blow. It was a slow tightening, each remembered moment pulling the knot tighter. She thought of the charm bracelet again, the one she had chosen for Megan piece by piece. Each charm a token of friendship. They'd sat together the night she gave her the seashell charm, wine glasses between them, laughing over the trip that had inspired it. Now, the thought of Megan fastening that clasp before stepping out on Daniel's arm felt almost surgical in its cruelty. Claire set the mug down and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to block out the images crowding her mind. But memory had a way of insisting, pulling up scene after scene until she could barely tell whether she was remembering or reimagining them in this new light. When she finally lowered her hands, the room looked the same. The pale countertop, the fruit bowl on the table, the faint scratch in the wooden floor where a chair had once been dragged too roughly. But nothing felt the same. The kitchen, the friendships, the marriage, they had all been rearranged without her knowing. The lines between loyalty and betrayal blurred so thoroughly she wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. She sat there until the coffee in her cup had gone completely cold, her fingers resting against the ceramic like she needed the grounding. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a part of her still resisted the conclusion she was drawing. But the rest of her, the part that had replayed every brunch, every vented frustration, every shared laugh, already knew. It had always been easier to see the truth once it had walked right up to you, wearing something you'd given it yourself. The steam from the teacup curled in slow, lazy ribbons, dissolving into the air between them. Claire sat at Julia's kitchen table. Her fingers curled loosely around the warm porcelain, though she hadn't yet taken a sip. Outside, the winter light filtered to the blinds in pale stripes, laying quiet shadows across the wooden surface. Julia sat opposite her, elbows resting on the table. Her expression one of patient concern, the kind that meant she knew there was more to this visit than just a casual drop-in. Claire started carefully, her voice low, like speaking it too loudly would give it a sharper edge. She told her about the photo from the gala, the bracelet, and the certainty that had settled over her in the days since. She didn't rush. She let each detail land, her eyes focused on the thin line of steam rising from her tea rather than on her sister's face. By the time she got to the part about recognizing Megan's smile, Julia's grip on her own mug had tightened, her knuckles pale against the ceramic. For a moment, Julia didn't speak. She leaned back slightly, taking the words, her lips pressing into a line that said more than any immediate reaction could. Then the anger began to surface, not in an explosion, but in a slow, measured heat. Her voice was calm, but the sharpness beneath it was unmistakable. "Megan, you mean to tell me the younger woman Daniel left you for as your best friend?" Claire nodded once, the movement small. "Was my best friend," she corrected softly, though the word was felt too neat, too final for something that still bled at the edges. Julia's eyes narrowed, her hand lifting slightly as if she might slam it down for emphasis, then stopping midair. "That is," she cut herself off, shaking her head. "I knew Daniel was capable of selfishness, but this is something else entirely. And Megan," the name hung in the air like something sour. "She sat at our family table. She came to Mom's birthday. She hugged you after Dad's funeral. How long has she been smiling to your face while—" She broke off again, her voice catching on the weight of thought. Claire's eyes stayed on her tea. "I don't know how long. And honestly, I don't think I want the timeline. I've been trying to piece it together, but every time I think I have a starting point, I remember something else and it gets messier." She lifted her cup and took a small sip, more for the pause than for the taste. "What I do know is I'm not ready to confront either of them. Not yet." Julia leaned forward, her brows knitting together. "Why not? Claire, they both betrayed you in the worst way. You have every right to stand in front of them and—" "I'm not ready," Claire repeated, her voice steady this time. She set her cup down gently, the ceramic clink barely audible. "If I go to them now, I'll get the story they want me to hear. They'll talk over me, justify it, twist it, and I'll walk away with more questions than answers. I need to know what I'm walking into before I open that door." Julia exhaled slowly, the tension in her jaw visible. "You're calmer than I would be," she admitted. "If it were me, I'd have shown up at their doorstep the second I found out." Claire almost smiled, a faint tug at the corner of her mouth that didn't reach her eyes. "I thought about it," she said. "Believe me. But the thing is, they expect me to fall apart. They expect me to act out of hurt, to make a scene they can point to later. I'd rather do this on my terms." Julia studied her for a moment, her expression shifting from anger to something like reluctant respect. "You're playing the long game," she said finally. Claire didn't answer directly. She reached for her tea again, letting the warmth seep into her hands, grounding her. "For now, I'm just observing, listening, letting them think I don't know." She glanced up at her sister, her eyes steady. "When I'm ready, it won't be an argument. It'll be the truth, laid out so plainly they can't talk around it." Julia's anger didn't fade, but it seemed to settle into a quieter place, her hand reaching across the table to rest briefly over Claire's. "Then I'll wait," she said. "But when you do confront them, you won't be doing it alone." The promise lingered between them, as steady and unshakable as the steam rising from their tea. And for the first time in days, Claire felt the smallest flicker of control return. The bell above the cafe door gave its familiar soft jingle as Claire stepped inside, a sound she hadn't heard in months but still recognized instantly. The air smelled the same, a mix of freshly ground coffee, warm pastries, and the faint sweetness of vanilla syrup that always seemed to linger near the counter. For years, this had been her and Megan's spot. Saturday mornings after the farmer's market, weekday afternoons when they both just needed a break, even the occasional late evening when the lights were dimmed low and the air was hushed. She hadn't planned on coming here today. She'd been walking without thinking, her feet carrying her down familiar streets, until she found herself standing outside the glass door, looking in at the wooden tables and the soft golden light. Part of her wanted to turn back immediately. The other part, the quieter, more stubborn part, pushed her forward. There were only a few customers scattered inside, the hum of quiet conversation filling the spaces between the hiss of the espresso machine. Claire made her way to the counter, noting that the layout hadn't changed. The same chalkboard menu hung on the wall, though the seasonal drinks were now written in a fresh, looping script. She ordered her usual without thinking, the words slipping out before she realized how easily her body remembered the ritual. The barista, a cheerful young woman with her hair tied back in a bright scarf, smiled warmly. Claire remembered her vaguely. She had been new toward the end of Claire's regular visits here. As the barista worked, she glanced up, recognition light in her face. You used to come in here all the time, right? With your friend, Megan? Claire felt her throat tighten, but forced herself to nod. Yes, she said simply. The barista's smile widened, oblivious to the undercurrent in Claire's tone. She's been coming in a lot lately, usually in the afternoons, always with her boyfriend. They seemed really happy. For a moment, Claire couldn't respond. The words hit her in an oddly physical way, like a shift in air pressure that left her ears ringing. The casualness of it, the way the barista said boyfriend without hesitation, made her stomach twist. She could picture without effort Megan sitting at their old table by the window, laughing over a cappuccino, leaning in toward Daniel the way she used to lean toward Claire when telling a secret. She managed a polite sound that passed for acknowledgement, careful not to let her expression change too much. "Oh," she said, her voice low enough to nearly blend with the background noise. The barista kept talking as she prepared the drink, describing a new dessert the cafe had started serving, asking if Claire had tried it yet. Claire nodded at the right moments, letting the words wash over her without taking them in. She kept her eyes fixed on the counter, her hands clasped loosely in front of her to keep them from tightening into fists. When her coffee was ready, she took it to a table in the back. Not their table, not the one by the window. She needed distance from that spot. She sat down and wrapped her hands around the warm cup, staring into the swirling foam. In her mind, the scene kept replaying. Only it wasn't her in the chair across from Megan. It was Daniel. The image made her chest feel tight. She tried to imagine Megan introducing him as her boyfriend. Had they laughed about it later? Had they savored the risk, bringing their affair into a place so deeply woven into her own life? Or had it been entirely thoughtless, just another convenient location for them to meet? Either answer carried its own kind of cruelty. The murmur of voices, the clink of cups against saucers, the low hum of the grinder, all the usual sound of cafe, felt louder than she remembered. She sipped her coffee slowly, letting the familiar bitterness anchor her. There was an odd sort of clarity settling in now. Pieces of the past months were sliding into place, the way small details only make sense once you know what you're really looking at. She finished her drink and stood, taking one last look at the space. It was strange how a place could stay exactly the same and yet feel entirely different, stripped of its comfort and replaced with something sharp-edged. As she left, the bell above the door jingled again, cheerful and unchanged, even as she stepped out into a street that suddenly felt colder than when she had arrived. The knowledge stayed with her, as heavy and quiet as the winter sky overhead. Claire sat at her dining table long after the sun had dipped below the horizon, a blank notebook open in front of her. She hadn't intended to start writing things down, but her mind kept circling the same thoughts, the same fragments of memory, and she needed to see them laid out in black ink. She wrote the months along the left side of the page, starting with the summer, before everything began to unravel. At first, the notes were scattered. A weekend trip Megan had canceled at the last minute, the business dinners Daniel claimed to have, the time she had dined alone because he was stuck at the office. The pattern wasn't obvious in the early months, but as her pen moved, the marks began to cluster, and the spaces between them seemed to shrink. September had 3 overlaps. October had 5. By November, it was almost weekly. She remembered Megan's excuses with clarity that startled her now. Work's been crazy. I promised a friend I'd help with something. Just not feeling up to going out tonight. At the time, none of it had struck her as odd. Life got busy, people had off days. But Daniel's absences always seemed to come hand in hand with those moments. It was as if they were moving on the same invisible schedule, one she had never been invited to see. The memory of particular Thursday nights surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Megan had texted to cancel their dinner, apologizing and promising to reschedule. Daniel, too, had called to say he'd be late. Claire had ended up eating takeout alone, watching television without really seeing it. Now she could almost picture them, perhaps in some dim restaurant across town, maybe even laughing over wine while she picked at cold noodles in her own kitchen. She flipped to a fresh page and drew 2 columns, one for Megan, one for Daniel. It felt clinical, almost attached, but her pulse betrayed her calm. She began listing each disappearance, each late return, each unexplained change in plans. The lines in the 2 columns seemed to mirror each other, date after date. What had once been random coincidences were now aligning with unnerving precision. She thought back to small details she had overlooked. The faint trace of an unfamiliar perfume on Daniel's jacket one night, which he brushed off as someone at work standing too close in a crowded meeting. The way Megan had smiled a little too much when Daniel's name came up in conversation, quickly looking away. Even moments from years ago now seemed suspect, like seeds planted long before she ever suspected anything. The more she wrote, the heavier her chest felt. She realized she wasn't just mapping their overlap. She was erasing her own blind spots. Every neat row on the page was proof that what felt like some betrayal had actually been a long, careful erosion. The thought made her grip the pen tighter, pressing so hard the ink bled into the paper. She pushed the notebook back and leaned against the chair, staring at the dates and words. There was no room left for wondering if she had imagined things, no space for the softer possibility that maybe it hadn't been deliberate. The symmetry of the timelines was too exact. It was the kind of match that only happened when people made it happen. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Claire closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. The timeline had given her something solid, but it had also given her something else, a new kind of resolve. She didn't yet know what she was going to do with this knowledge, but she knew it would not be left sitting in a notebook forever. She capped her pen and closed the cover, the pages inside now heavier with truth than paper should ever feel. The overlap was no longer invisible, and that meant they couldn't hide behind it anymore. Claire sat on the couch with her laptop balanced on her knees, the screen's pale light casting a glow across the dim living room. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that made every creak in the walls sound louder. She wasn't sure why she had opened the old group chat in the first place. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe a form of self-torture. But once the scroll began, she couldn't stop. The group had been small, just her, Megan, and 2 other friends from college. It had been a space for harmless chatter, birthday plans, venting about work, and sharing memes that didn't make sense to anyone outside their circle. But as she went further back, she started to notice something she hadn't before. The jokes Megan had made about Daniel, ones Claire had brushed off at the time, carried an edge she couldn't unsee now. One message from 2 years ago popped out. Asterisk Claire, does Daniel even know how to pick up his socks? Or is that just part of his charm? Asterisk at the time, Claire had replied with a laughing emoji, thinking it was friendly teasing. Now, the line felt different, as if Megan had been testing boundaries, seeing how far she could go before the humor turned into something sharper. A few weeks later in the chat, there was a comment about a dinner party Claire had hosted. Asterisk, Daniel sure knows how to work a room. Maybe too well. Asterisk, she remembered laughing when she first read it, imagining Daniel's awkward jokes and too long stories. But now she wondered if Megan had meant it as a compliment for his charisma or a hint at her own interest. The deeper she went, the more these small remarks began to form a pattern. Megan had a way of turning observations about Claire's marriage into humor that put her slightly on the outside. If anyone else had said them, it might have felt intrusive. For Megan, it had always felt like harmless honesty, the kind you expect from a best friend. But there were also messages that didn't read like jokes at all now. A photo Claire had posted of her and Daniel at a wedding had prompted Megan to write, asterisk, "That suit looks way too good on him, Claire. You better keep an eye out." Asterisk, Claire had replied at the time with, asterisk, "I know, right? He cleans up well," asterisk, not realizing she might be agreeing with someone who had already decided to take that suit and the man in it for herself. She stopped scrolling for a moment, leaning back against the couch. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she couldn't bring herself to close the window. Instead, she scrolled further, almost punishing herself with each new discovery. She saw the times Megan had joked about stealing Daniel if Claire ever got tired of him, the playful kidding that now looked like trial balloons for something more serious. There were even subtle questions about Claire's schedule, when she'd be out of town, when she had work events. They were always buried in conversation about something else, so Claire had never thought twice about them. Now she saw them as small pieces of reconnaissance, each one planning itself quietly in the background until the day it could be used. The most jarring was a single message Megan had sent late at night to the group, months before Daniel had left. Asterisk, "Sometimes I think I know Daniel better than Claire does." Asterisk, at the time, Claire had rolled her eyes and typed something sarcastic back, but tonight the words burned. She closed the chat window but couldn't stop thinking about it. The messages didn't just make her question the past year. They made her question how long the betrayal had been building. Had Megan been playing this game from the very beginning of their friendship, or had it grown over time, like a shadow creeping across a floor until it finally covered everything? The thought left Claire with a hollowness that even anger couldn't fill. She shut the laptop, the click of it closing sounding far too final, and sat in the darkness, wondering just how far back the lies really went. The news came to Claire on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered in the offhand way people share gossip, without realizing it might land like a blow. She was in the break room at work, waiting for the coffee machine to finish its slow drip, when her coworker Denise walked in, phone in hand, still laughing about something she'd read. Without much preamble, she said, "Oh, by the way, I saw Daniel at the Chamber of Commerce mixer last week. He was with Megan. He introduced her as his girlfriend. Can you believe that? Didn't you just?" Her voice trailed off when she caught the look on Claire's face. Claire felt her fingers tighten involuntarily around the edge of the counter. The coffee machine hissed and gurgled behind her, filling the silence. She had to remind herself to breathe evenly. The words girlfriend and Megan clung together in her mind like they were fused, impossible to separate. Denise shifted awkwardly, muttered something about not realizing it was so soon, and left the room. Claire stood there for a moment, unmoving, letting the sound of the brewing coffee mask the thudding of her heartbeat. She had known, of course. The bracelet, the photographs, the old group messages, all of it had told her what they were. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing that Daniel had introduced Megan, not just as someone in his life, but as his partner, his public claim, was different. It was no longer whispers or sideways glances. It was an announcement, and it was happening just weeks after the divorce papers had been filed, as if the ink wasn't even dry before he decided to parade her in front of others. She poured herself a cup of coffee, though she didn't want it anymore, and carried it back to her desk. She tried to focus on the spreadsheet open on her computer screen, but the numbers blurred. She could see Daniel standing at some networking event, his confident smile in place, one hand resting casually at the small of Megan's back. She could imagine the way Megan would tilt her head toward him, her laughter timed perfectly to whatever charm he was weaving into the crowd. They had always been good at presenting themselves, Daniel with his polished ease, Megan with her quick wit and effortless beauty. Together, they would be magnetic. The idea that he had so quickly and so publicly rewritten the narrative of his life made Claire feel invisible, like their years together could be erased by a single evening's introductions. She wondered how he had introduced her, all those years ago, to his colleagues and acquaintances. Had there been the same warmth in his voice, the same proud glint in his eye, or had she been a placeholder until the person he truly wanted came along? Her phone buzzed with a message from Julia, her sister. It was short. Asterisk heard from someone at work about Daniel and Megan. Want to come over tonight? Asterisk Claire stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. Asterisk not tonight. I just need to think. Asterisk she wasn't ready to talk about it out loud. Talking would make it too real, and she wasn't sure she could keep her composure. Later that evening, she found herself pacing her living room. Coffee long since cold, replaying the scene she hadn't witnessed. She pictured Megan standing there, knowing full well how fresh the wound was for Claire, knowing that people from their shared world might see and talk. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the point was to cement herself as Daniel's future, to make it impossible for Claire to believe there had ever been any loyalty between them. The thought made Claire's stomach knot. She sat down, pulling a throw blanket around her shoulders, not for warmth but for the feeling of being contained. She realized she had been waiting, in some quiet corner of her mind, for Daniel to move slowly, for him to at least acknowledge that what had happened was messy enough to require discretion. Instead, he had chosen spectacle. And Megan, once her closest friend, had stood beside him smiling. The coffee table still held a framed photo of Claire with both of them, taken at a barbecue just a year earlier. They were laughing, arms around each other. Looking at it now felt like staring into a stranger's life. She turned the frame face down. Claire had not looked at her old calendar in months. It was still tucked into the kitchen drawer, beneath a stack of takeout menus and half-used notepads, the kind of object you keep without realizing why. That morning, while searching for a pen, she found it again. The cover was bent, a smear of coffee staining the edge, but the pages inside were intact, filled with neat handwriting and the small, private markers of a life once lived in sync with someone else's. She flipped through it without thinking, scanning birthdays, reminders, grocery lists written in the margins. And then she saw the date, Megan's birthday. She had written it in her careful script, along with the words dinner at Bel Aria, 7:30 p.m., surprise. It was underlined twice. Claire remembered making the reservation weeks in advance, calling the restaurant herself, making sure they would have Megan's favorite table near the window, the one that caught the soft glow of the street lamps outside. Her eyes lingered on the neat lines of ink, and a slow unease began to creep in. That date, she knew it for another reason too. It was the same night Daniel had told her he'd be working late. He had come home after midnight, smelling faintly of cologne and something richer, like truffle oil or garlic cream sauce, the sort of scent that clung to you after a good restaurant meal. She remembered asking, lightly, if he had at least grabbed dinner while he was out. He'd nodded vaguely, saying he grabbed something near the office. But seeing the date now, framed by her own handwriting, she could feel the threads pulling together. Bel Aria was the kind of place Daniel liked to save for special occasions. He had taken her there for anniversaries, for promotions, for the kind of nights that called for champagne and candlelight. The idea of him being there on Megan's birthday, instead at the office, it was too sharp to be coincidence. Claire closed the calendar and sat back in her chair, the edges pressing into her palms. She thought back to that night. She had sent Megan a birthday text earlier in the day, but Megan hadn't responded until the next morning, saying she'd been busy and thanking Claire in a tone that seemed hurried. At the time, Claire had assumed she'd been out with family or some new date she hadn't yet mentioned. She had no reason to think Daniel was part of it, but now the possibility felt not just plausible, but obvious. Her mind replayed the details she'd ignored. The way Daniel had seemed almost energized when he came home, his mood unusually light for someone who'd supposedly been buried in work all evening. The faint mark at the edge of his jaw, which he had dismissed as a shadow, could easily have been a smudge of lipstick. She had gone to bed that night, without questioning any of it, content to believe his explanation. That trust now felt like a relic from another life. She opened the calendar again, running her fingers over the ink as if the memory might change under her touch. But the date didn't shift. The words didn't rearrange themselves into something more innocent. The reservation for Megan's surprise dinner was there in black and white. A reminder that Claire had once been planning to celebrate her best friend, not knowing that the two people she trusted most were likely sitting across from each other at a table meant for her gesture. The rest of the day passed in a haze. She found herself staring out the window at the bare trees, their branches swaying in the winter wind, wondering how many moments like that had passed without her knowing. How many birthdays, late nights, and work events had been pieces of another life running parallel to her own. That evening, she put the calendar back in the drawer, this time at the very bottom, beneath a stack of old mail she didn't need. She couldn't throw it away. Not yet. It was a clue, another fragment of the truth she was assembling. And while she wasn't sure what she would do with that truth, she knew she wasn't done collecting it. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, when the winter light was thin and the house felt too quiet. Claire was halfway through folding laundry when her phone lit up with a name she hadn't seen in years, Vanessa Hale. They'd been close in college, bonded over late-night study sessions, and shared cheap bottles of wine in cramped apartments. Life had pulled them in different directions after graduation, and their contact had dwindled to the occasional holiday card or Facebook like. Seeing her name now brought a small, unexpected warmth. She answered, and after first exchange of pleasantries, there was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that signaled there was something more, something waited. Vanessa's voice softened, carrying a mix of guilt and hesitation. She said she had been meaning to call for a while, but wasn't sure if it was her place. That was when Claire's chest tightened. She knew this tone. It was the sound of someone holding on to a truth they weren't sure the other person wanted to hear. Vanessa didn't dance around it for long. She said she had seen Daniel months ago, long before Claire and Daniel's separation had become public. It was at an art gallery opening downtown. She explained, one of those events where people linger around modern installations pretending to understand them. He hadn't been alone. He was the tall brunette, stylish, younger, the kind of woman who turned heads. At first, Vanessa had assumed she was a work colleague, but then she saw the way they stood close together, the way Daniel touched her back lightly when they moved through the crowd. And then she saw them kiss. Not a quick, casual gesture, but a lingering one that made their connection clear. Claire's throat went dry. She asked, steady but quiet, if Vanessa remembered anything else about the woman. There was a beat before Vanessa said yes. She had recognized her. Not right away. It had taken a moment. But eventually she realized it was Megan. She even remembered thinking it was odd, seeing Claire's best friend with her husband. She had assumed there must be some innocent explanation, but the way they looked at each other had made her uncomfortable enough to leave early. The silence on Claire's end stretched for a moment too long. She could hear Vanessa starting to apologize, saying she hadn't wanted to get involved, hadn't wanted to risk damaging a friendship, if it had all been a misunderstanding. Claire understood the instinct. If their positions were reversed, she wasn't sure she would have done any differently. Still, the confirmation hit harder than she expected. Up until now, so much of what she knew had been pieced together from hints, timelines, and suspicions. Hearing it spoken aloud by someone she trusted turned the suspicion into something undeniable. Vanessa's voice was careful, almost pleading, as she told Claire she'd been debating this call for months. She said she wished she'd said something sooner, but she had convinced herself that if Claire needed to know, she would already know. Claire assured her that she didn't blame her. People avoided these kinds of truths for a reason. They were messy, they hurt, and they changed things in ways that couldn't be undone. After they hung up, Claire stayed in the kitchen, staring at the folded laundry she hadn't finished putting away. Her mind replayed the image Vanessa had painted. Daniel and Megan in a crowded room, smiling in the soft light of an art gallery, their lives overlapping in ways that excluded her entirely. She thought about all the times Megan had claimed to be too busy to meet up, and the way Daniel had shrugged off questions about his evenings. How many people had seen them together before she had even begun to suspect? How many had chosen to stay silent? The phone call left her both heavier and clearer. She now had confirmation from someone with no reason to lie. It didn't make a betrayal any easier to bear, but it stripped away the last layer of doubt. Whatever story Daniel and Megan had told themselves to justify what they'd done, it started long before the divorce papers were signed. And now, Claire was beginning to see that the truth had been in plain sight for much longer than she'd realized. She had just been looking the other way. It was strange, looking back and realizing how many of the signs had been there long, before anything obvious happened. At the time, they had seemed like small, almost harmless shifts, the sort of fluctuations that happen in any long-term marriage. But now, with everything laid bare, Claire could see them for what they were. She remembered the first unexplained expense. It had been buried in the credit card statement between grocery charges and utility payments, a high-end boutique in the city they rarely visited. When she asked about it, Daniel said it was a gift for a client's wife, part of keeping up appearances in his line of work. She hadn't questioned it further. After all, Daniel's job often required gestures she didn't fully understand. But over time, there were more. Restaurant bills for two when he told her he'd grabbed a quick bite after work. Charges at stores he'd never shopped in before, for brands that didn't interest him. Claire had even joked once, lightly, that maybe he was keeping a secret wardrobe somewhere. He'd laugh, but it had been quick and empty. The phone habits came next. Daniel had always been a little attached to his phone, but suddenly it was with him constantly. In his pocket during dinner, face down but close at hand when they watched television. He had started stepping outside to take certain calls, muttering something about poor reception in the living room, though their signal had always been fine. Text messages were read quickly, then the screen was locked before she could glance at them. Once, she had walked into the room and seen him delete a thread of messages before slipping the phone back into his pocket. He'd looked up with a too casual expression, like a man trying to convince himself he hadn't been caught. Then came the gym. Daniel had never been particularly concerned with fitness beyond the occasional weekend jog. But last spring, he'd joined a high-end fitness club, insisting it was time to take his health more seriously. He started going 4, sometimes 5, evenings a week, always after work. He claimed it helped him unwind, that he was finally prioritizing himself. But there had been something in the way he lingered before leaving, carefully styling his hair and spraying cologne before heading out to what was supposedly just a workout. She had teased him once about dressing up for the treadmill, and he had only smiled faintly, not meeting her eyes. The change in their conversations was subtle, but it was there. Topics they used to share, books, family updates, weekend plans, seemed to slip through the cracks. He was distracted more often, offering vague responses that suggested he was thinking of something else. Even his laughter, when it came, sounded different, quieter, as though it belonged to another room entirely. Looking back, Claire wondered how much of this she had noticed at the time and chosen not to see. It was easier then to believe that life was simply moving through one of its uneven stretches. They had been married long enough for comfortable silences to feel normal, for independent routines to develop. She had trusted that the foundation was still solid beneath it all. There was one moment she remembered with particular clarity now. They had been at a friend's anniversary party, standing among people they had known for years. Daniel had stepped away to take a call, disappearing outside for almost 20 minutes. When he came back, his mood had shifted, lighter, almost energized. He'd barely touched his drink after that, and when they danced later, there had been a restlessness in his movements, as though his mind was already somewhere else. At the time, Claire had brushed it aside. She had told herself he was just tired or maybe thinking about work. But in hindsight, she could see the thread running through all of it. The boutique receipts, the locked phone, the cologne before the gym. Each sign had been a loose stitch, and together they had unraveled the fabric of their marriage long, before she realized anything was wrong. Now, those memories felt like watching a play in which she had been both participant and oblivious audience. The script had been written long before she understood the plot, and every glance, every late night, every unexplained charge had been a line delivered with perfect rehearsal, and she had clapped along, never knowing performance wasn't meant for her. The charity auction had always been one of those rare events Claire looked forward to, not for spectacle of wealth or the competition over bids, but for the sense of tradition. For nearly a decade, she and Daniel had attended together, often dressing in coordinated colors, arriving early enough to greet the organizers and slipping into easy conversation with the same circle of familiar faces. This year, the invitation had arrived just like always, addressed to her, but the thought of going alone had made her hesitate. Still, it was for a cause she cared about, and she wasn't about to let their broken marriage erase her place in a space she had helped support. She arrived later than usual, deliberately avoiding the bustle of the cocktail hour, hoping it would spare her any awkward small talk about Daniel's absence. The venue, a historic hotel ballroom draped in gold accents and lit by warm chandeliers, was already full when she stepped inside. Voices mingled with the clink of glasses, and a string quartet played softly from the corner. For a moment, she let herself feel detached, like an observer moving through a painting, removed from the emotional weight of the evening. She was halfway to her table when her eyes caught on a familiar profile at the bar. Daniel stood there, leaning casually against the polished wood, a glass in his hand. He was laughing, that low, confident laugh she knew so well, but it wasn't directed at a client or an acquaintance. Next to him, angled slightly toward him, was Megan. The sight was like being doused in cold water. Claire stopped mid-step, her body rooted while her pulse roared in her ears. Megan's hair was styled in loose waves, the way she often wore it when she wanted to look effortlessly put together. She wore a black cocktail dress with a daring neckline and a pair of earrings Claire had once admired in a store window with her. On her wrist, the silver charm bracelet caught the light, the same one that started to unravel the truth weeks ago. They were close enough for their shoulders to touch, their postures relaxed in that intimate way that suggested habit rather than novelty. Megan's hand brushed Daniel's arm as she leaned in to say something, and he tilted his head toward her with an ease that twisted in Claire's stomach. She had thought she was prepared for the possibility of seeing them together. After all, she'd already pieced together more than enough evidence. But the reality was different, sharper, more cutting than she'd imagined. It wasn't just a betrayal that stung. It was a way they seemed so at home in a space that had once belonged to her and Daniel together. This was their event, their tradition, and now it was being rewritten in real time. She considered turning around, slipping out before either of them noticed, but her feet didn't move. Instead, she took in the details. The way Daniel rested his hand briefly on Megan's back as they laughed. The casual intimacy of sharing a drink before the bidding began. They didn't look like people caught in a scandal. They looked like a couple who believed they had the right to be there, unchallenged. A waiter passed by, offering her a flute of champagne. She took it without thinking, more for something to hold than to drink. The bubbles rose in a steady stream, and she found herself staring into the glass, using it as a shield while she tried to slow her breathing. Around her, the crowd moved easily, oblivious to the silent earthquake happening in her chest. It was Julia's voice in her mind that kept her standing there. Her sister had told her once, after a difficult breakup in her own life, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply stay present. Not run, not hide, just exist in the same room as those who thought they'd erased you, and let them feel the weight of your presence. So Claire did. She walked to her table without rushing, without glancing back, though every sense told her Daniel had noticed. Whether Megan had seen her yet, she didn't know, but she sat, placed her champagne on the linen-covered table, and kept her expression calm. Inside, her thoughts spun in quiet, deliberate circles. Not about confrontation, not yet, but about how much they had taken without permission. Tonight, she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her retreat. Claire had been pretending to study the auction catalog, her eyes moving over the glossy pages without absorbing a single word. When it happened, a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision drew her gaze upward. Across the room, beyond the clinking glasses and muted laughter, Megan was no longer mid-laugh. She was staring directly at her. The change in her face was instant. Just moments earlier, Megan's expression had been light, her mouth tilted in that polished, social smile she used at events. Now, it was as if the air had thickened between them. Her lips parted slightly, not in greeting but in surprise, and her posture stiffened. Daniel, still angled toward her, noticed a shift and followed her line of sight. When his eyes found Claire, the smile he'd been wearing dissolved, the easy confidence draining from his face. For a moment, they all just stayed that way, suspended in a strange, quiet standoff. The sound of the room carried on. The auctioneer making announcements over the microphone, the faint clinking of cutlery as servers cleared plates. But inside that triangle of glances, everything felt muted. Claire didn't move, didn't give them the satisfaction of an immediate reaction. She simply let them look. Daniel's expression shifted first. His jaw tightened, a flash of discomfort breaking through the practiced composure he often wore in public. Megan's eyes darted down, then back up again, as though she couldn't decide whether to acknowledge her or pretend she hadn't seen her at all. The distance between them felt vast, though Claire knew that as she crossed the ballroom, it would take less than 30 seconds to reach them. She could already imagine the scene, the sudden hush around the corner of the room, the brittle pleasantries, the inevitable attempt at justification. But Claire had no interest in that performance. Confrontation wasn't what she wanted. Not here. Not in front of people who had no idea of the history layered beneath their smiles and champagne flutes. She thought of every word she could say, every accusation she could hurl, and found that none of it would change the simple truth already hanging in the air. They had been caught, and they both knew it. She set the auction catalog down on the table and rose to her feet. The motion was deliberate, steady, as though she were simply excusing herself for a phone call. Her chair slid back with a soft scrape against the polished floor. She didn't rush. Instead, she lifted her clutch from the table, adjusted the strap of her coat over her arm, and let her gaze sweep once more across the room, not at them but past them, as if they were no more than a passing detail. And then, just before she turned toward the exit, she allowed her eyes to meet Daniel's again. It wasn't a glare, wasn't even cold. It was level, unblinking, the kind of look that said she saw everything she needed to see and required no explanation. His mouth opened slightly, as though he might speak, but no words came. Megan stood frozen, a hand resting on the stem of her wine glass, her face pale beneath the warm lighting. Claire turned away before either of them could recover. She walked toward the double doors at the back of the ballroom, her steps quiet but certain. No one tried to stop her. The crowd seemed to part without her asking, conversations folding around her as she passed. Outside the heavy doors, the air was cooler, the hallway dimmer, and the faint sound of the event softened into a distant hum. She didn't pause to look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing anymore. The valet stand was empty when she stepped outside, the winter air crisp against her cheeks. She drew in a long breath, feeling the sharpness of it clear her head, and handed her ticket to the approaching attendant. Her car pulled up within minutes, headlights washing the front of the building in pale light. As she slid into the driver's seat, Claire felt no rush of triumph, no swelling of victory. What she felt instead was a quiet, steady release. Walking away had been the only thing that belonged entirely to her in that moment. Not stolen, not shared, not explained. She started the engine, merged into the slow stream of cars leaving the event, and let the road take her home. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the old heating system. Claire set her bag on the kitchen counter, hung her coat on the back of a chair, and stood for a moment, staring at the blank notepad she'd pulled from the drawer. The charity auction was still fresh in her mind, the way their faces had changed when they saw her, the unspoken truth that filled the space between them. But she didn't want to act on impulse. What she wanted now was clarity. She poured herself a glass of water, carried it to the table, and sat down. The notepad lay in front of her, a pen resting on its spiral binding. She hesitated, then drew a line down the middle of the first page. On the left, she wrote dates and events. On the right, details. It felt clinical, almost like building a case file, but this wasn't about lawyers or public confrontations. She needed to see the full timeline laid out, to understand how long this had been going on and how deeply it had crossed into her life. The first entry came easily, the night Daniel had announced a divorce. She wrote the date and the words, "Want a divorce. Says he's met someone else." In the details column, she added January. Cold night, no fight, no explanation beyond that. From there, she began working backward. The Friday night dinner at the Italian restaurant, when he'd been restless and distracted. Megan's birthday, the reservation she'd made and canceled without knowing why. She filled in the weeks when Megan had been oddly unavailable, claiming last-minute work deadlines or family obligations, and matched them with Daniel's sudden business trips. Page after page began to form. Every event she could remember, every stray comment from a mutual acquaintance, every photo or text that now carried a different meaning. All of it went into the notebook. She opened her laptop and scrolled through old messages, pausing to take notes. There were screenshots of the group chat she'd once shared with Megan and a few other friends. Little jokes that had seemed harmless at the time, but now looked like subtle digs. She copied the dates and wrote brief descriptions, careful to stick to facts and avoid letting emotion color the record. Hours passed like this. She moved between her phone, her computer, and the notepad, cross-checking calendar entries with bank statements she still had access to. There were charges for restaurants she'd never been to, boutique hotels in the city, when he claimed to be working late at the office, gift shop purchases she couldn't place. Each entry went into its own line, building a structure she could step back from and study. By the time she closed her laptop, the first 3 pages were full. The story they told wasn't one of sudden betrayal, but a gradual erosion, a series of overlapping lies, concealed with enough care to keep her from seeing the full shape of it until now. It struck her how deliberate it must have been, how many decisions they had both made to keep it hidden, and yet how many tiny cracks had still shown through if she'd known where to look. She leaned back in her chair, the pen still in her hand, and looked at the pages she'd filled. It was strange, but having it in front of her, black ink on white paper, made it feel less like a storm swirling in her head and more like a map she could read. This wasn't about revenge. She wasn't going to use it to humiliate them or fuel gossip. She wanted to understand the scope of what had been taken from her, not just in trust but in time, in shared spaces, in the quiet parts of her life she had thought were safe. Before going to bed, she slipped the notepad into the drawer of her bedside table. She didn't need to look at it every day, but she wanted it close, not as a weapon, but as a record, a reminder that the truth was there, clear and undeniable, no matter how they might try to rewrite it. Upstairs, as she turned off the lights and the house sank into darkness, she felt the same quiet certainty she'd felt when walking out of the auction. She didn't need to confront them to know what had happened. She had already put the pieces together, and that was enough. It was late on a Tuesday afternoon when Claire's phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she recognized but hadn't seen in years. It was Lisa, someone who had been part of their wider circle back when Friday nights meant dinner parties and group vacations. They had drifted apart over time, and Claire hesitated before answering, unsure what could prompt the sudden contact. Lisa's voice was careful, almost brittle, as she asked if Claire had a few minutes to talk. There was a tension there that made it impossible to say no. They agreed to meet at a small cafe halfway between their neighborhoods, a place Claire had never visited. When she arrived, Lisa was already at a corner table, a coffee cooling in front of her and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked different, older, of course, but also weary in a way that wasn't about age. As soon as Claire sat down, Lisa took a breath like she'd been holding it for days. She began with an apology. It tumbled out quickly, as though the words had been sitting on her tongue for months, maybe longer. She said she should have told Claire sooner, that it hadn't been her place to protect either Daniel or Megan, but that she convinced herself staying out of it was the safest thing. Claire listened without interrupting, her hands resting flat on the table, her face giving nothing away. Then Lisa said it plainly. Megan had started seeing Daniel, while still calling Claire her best friend. It hadn't been a brief fling or a sudden impulse. According to Lisa, it had begun quietly, the way affairs often do, with late-night conversations and innocent outings that blurred into something else. Lisa had seen them together more than once, not just in public, but in ways that left no doubt about their closeness. She admitted she'd been there the night Daniel and Megan had arrived at a party together, unashamed, already in sync. Claire felt the words settle into her, heavy but unsurprising. This wasn't news so much as confirmation, the final piece clicking into place. She had already suspected the truth, had mapped it out in her mind and in her notebook. But hearing it aloud from someone who had been there was different. It stripped away the last possibility of misunderstanding. Lisa's voice faltered when she said she confronted Megan once, asked her directly how she could justify what she was doing. Megan had shrugged it off, saying Claire and Daniel's marriage had been practically over and that she was simply being honest about what she wanted. Lisa admitted that after that conversation, she'd stopped asking questions. She didn't want to be in the middle of it, didn't want to choose sides, and so she kept her distance. But watching the two of them act as though nothing was wrong and hearing the things Megan continued to say about Claire behind her back had worn her down. Claire stirred her coffee, though she hadn't taken a sip since sitting down. She told Lisa she appreciated the honesty, even if it had come late. There was no anger in her tone, no dramatic reaction. She had learned, over the past few months, that silence could hold more power than shouting. Lisa seemed almost unsettled by her calmness, glancing away as if she'd expected tears or fury. They talked for another half hour, mostly about trivial things, old friends, work, the weather, until the weight of the real conversation hung too heavily between them. As they stood to leave, Lisa touched Claire's arm and repeated her apology. Claire nodded, thanked her again, and stepped out into the fading light. Walking to her car, she thought about how strange it was that betrayal could be both devastating and predictable. She had always imagined that a revelation like this would feel like a wound reopening, but instead it felt like the quiet closing of a door that had been ajar for far too long. She didn't need to dwell on it. She had heard what she needed to hear, and now the truth lived in the open, where it could no longer shift or hide. When she drove home, the sun was dipping low behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the road. The sky was the same muted gold she remembered from evenings years ago, when she and Megan would sit on her porch with glasses of wine, talking about their lives as though they would always be on the same side. That image didn't hurt the way she thought it might. It was just a moment in time, now sealed away in the past where it belonged. It was a Sunday afternoon when Claire's phone buzzed with a notification she hadn't asked for. A mutual acquaintance had liked one of Megan's new posts, and the algorithm decided she might want to see it. She almost ignored it. She had long since stopped actively checking Megan's profile, but the thumbnail caught her attention. It was a sunlit shoreline, turquoise water meeting pale sand, with a pair of figures standing close together in the surf. Claire tapped the post, the image filling her screen. It took her less than a second to know exactly where it had been taken. The small cove on the southern tip of Santorini where they had stayed years ago. It had been the last trip they had taken as a trio, Claire, Daniel, and Megan, back when she had thought of Megan as family. The trip had been filled with lazy mornings, shared meals on the balcony, and hours spent wandering winding streets. She could remember the sound of the waves that day, the smell of grilled fish in the taverna just up the hill, and the way Megan had insisted on taking dozens of photos to capture every angle of the view. But this was not one of those group photos. The frame had been altered, cropped tightly, so that only Daniel and Megan remained. Claire remembered the original. The three of them, standing side by side, arms slung over each other's shoulders. She could still see, in her mind, her own face in that spot Megan had cleanly erased. It wasn't a haphazard crop. It was deliberate. Megan had shifted the focus, cutting away everything except her and Daniel in matching sunglasses, smiling like they'd been the only ones there. The caption read something vague, just a string of heart emojis and the words, "always meant to be." The comments beneath it were a stream of congratulations, heart reactions, and remarks about how happy they looked together. A few people noted how young they appeared in the photo, asking if it was from the start of their relationship. Megan hadn't corrected them. She simply replied with more hearts and a wink. Claire's fingers hovered over her phone. She could have said something then, pointed out the truth, tagged herself in the original, posted the unedited version. But she didn't. Instead, she saved the image to her phone, placing it in the growing folder where she'd been collecting these quiet little pieces of proof. It wasn't about confronting them in public. It was about keeping the record intact. She wanted to remember the reality beneath the curated story they were now telling. Sitting at her kitchen table, Claire studied the photo again. She could see the way Daniel was leaning toward Megan in the shot, something she hadn't noticed at the time. It was subtle, but it was there, the kind of body language that seems invisible until you know exactly what you're looking for. She thought back to that afternoon on the beach, The way Megan had insisted she take the picture from a certain angle, how she joked that it was for the memories. The thought that those memories had been planned with an entirely different meaning left a sour taste in her mouth. She put her phone down and went to the window, watching as the late-day light shifted across the street. The air outside looked crisp, almost brittle, the kind of winter day where every sound carries a little farther. She could hear children laughing in the distance, the muffled bark of a dog, the faint hum of a passing car. It all felt grounding, ordinary, a reminder that her life existed beyond the frame of someone else's narrative. Megan's post would get its likes, its little rush of validation, its carefully shaped impression. But Claire knew the unedited version of that day, the reality of who was there and what it meant at the time. And unlike Megan, she had no need to rewrite it. She let the phone screen go dark, the image filed away, and turned her attention to the simple, quiet work of living in the present. The email arrived just after 9 in the evening, slipping into Claire's inbox between a grocery store promotion and a reminder from her insurance company. At first, she didn't recognize the sender, a string of random letters and numbers, no name attached. The subject line read only, "You should know." For a moment, she considered deleting it without opening. Anonymous messages rarely brought anything good, and she had been making a habit of protecting her own peace where she could. But something about the timing, the starkness of the subject line, made her click. The body of the email was brief, only one sentence. "He was never honest with you." Below it were several attached screenshots. Claire hesitated before opening the first image, the screen of her phone suddenly feeling heavier in her hand. The screenshot showed a text conversation, the contact name cropped out, but the number was familiar, Daniels. The messages were playful, littered with inside jokes, affectionate nicknames, and the kind of casual flirtation that could only exist between two people who knew they were on dangerous ground. One message in particular made her chest tighten. "Wish you were here instead of her." The date stamp told her it was from more than a year before the divorce, long before Daniel had said anything about meeting someone else. She scrolled through the other images, each one a snapshot of the same thread. There were late-night exchanges about sneaking away for weekends, about dinners that Claire remembered Daniel claiming were work-related, about moments when he'd been stuck at the office, but had apparently been somewhere else entirely. And then there was the unmistakable proof, a message where Megan's name appeared in full. "Megan, I can't stop thinking about last night." The words hit harder than she expected, even after everything she'd pieced together. She had suspected. She had calculated timelines. She had gathered fragments of confirmation from conversations and observations. But this was concrete. This was them, in their own words, carving out a parallel life while hers went on beside it. She read through the chain twice, not because she needed clarity, but because she wanted to be certain she wasn't missing anything. There was no mistaking the tone, the intent, or the context. It was intimate, conspiratorial, built on shared secrecy. She wondered who had sent it to her, a mutual friend with a guilty conscience, someone in her orbit who had seen too much, or perhaps even someone who had stumbled across the messages by accident. The anonymity didn't bother her as much as she thought it would. Whoever it was, they had chosen to show her something she might never have otherwise confirmed. Claire closed the email and sat in the quiet of her living room. The dog stirred from his place at her feet, resting his head on her knee as if sensing the change in her. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, grounding herself in the simple, solid presence beside her. The proof didn't change the past, but it clarified the shape of it. All the gaps in the story were filling in, the shadows no longer leaving room for doubt. She considered forwarding the email to herself at a separate address, just in case. Instead, she printed the screenshots, sliding them into the same envelope where she'd been keeping her notes, photos, and other scraps of evidence. It wasn't about building a case for anyone else. It was about making sure she had the full truth, stripped of any version they might tell to soften their part in it. When she returned to her laptop, the email still sat open on the screen. She hovered over the delete button, but didn't press it. She left it there, marked unread, knowing she could come back to it if she needed to. Outside, the January wind rattled the bare branches against the window, and somewhere in the neighborhood a door slammed shut. Claire sat back, the room settling into stillness again, and let the weight of certainty take its place alongside everything else she had learned. The invitation came in the form of a handwritten note, something almost nobody bothered with anymore. Claire found it in her mailbox one Thursday morning, tucked between a utility bill and a flyer for a new pizza place. The envelope was pale blue, her name written in careful cursive she recognized instantly. Inside, on stationery that smelled faintly of lavender, Daniel's mother asked if Claire might come by for tea that weekend. There was no mention of Daniel, no explanation, only a polite request and a time. Claire thought about it for 2 days before deciding to go. She wasn't sure what she expected. A polite exchange, perhaps, or an awkward attempt at small talk to bridge the space left by the divorce. Daniel's mother, Evelyn, had always been gracious, reserved in a way that suggested she rarely said more than she meant to. But she had also been kind, someone who remembered Claire's birthday without fail, who once knitted her a scarf because she'd offhandedly mentioned losing one during a trip. Saturday arrived cold and clear. Claire drove across town to the modest brick house where Evelyn had lived for decades. The front garden was bare for winter, save for the stubborn green of a rosemary bush by the walkway. Evelyn opened the door before Claire could knock twice, ushering her in with a warmth that caught her off guard. The living room was exactly as she remembered. Lace curtains filtering the afternoon light, a faint scent of cinnamon and polish lingering in the air. They settled at the small round table in the kitchen, steam rising from delicate china cups. For a while they spoke of ordinary things. The weather, the new grocery store that had opened nearby, Evelyn's attempts at baking bread. It was only after a long pause, during which Evelyn seemed to study the pattern on her teacup, that her voice shifted. "I suppose," she began, "you know about Megan." The directness of it landed like a small shock. Claire nodded, her hands tightening around the warm porcelain. Evelyn sighed, setting her cup down with care. "I never approved of her," she said, her tone flat but not cruel. Something about the way she looked at Daniel. It was too much, too soon. And I told him so, though I'm sure he didn't listen. He rarely does when he thinks he's in love. Claire stayed quiet, letting her continue. "I suspected something was happening while you were still married," Evelyn admitted. "Not because of anything Daniel told me, of course. He wouldn't, but there were little signs." She would drop his name into conversation, tell stories about seeing him in places you hadn't mentioned. Once, she even called my house looking for him, and when I asked why, she stammered before saying it was about a surprise for you. I didn't believe it. Her gaze met Claire's across the table, steady but apologetic. "I didn't know how to tell you. I thought it wasn't my place, and I fear it would only cause trouble if I was wrong. But I see now that not saying anything may have been worse." Claire absorbed the words slowly, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and resignation rise in her. There was no bitterness in Evelyn's voice, only a quiet regret that matched the weight Claire had been carrying. "I wish you had told me," Claire said finally. "I know," Evelyn replied, "and I'm sorry. You deserved the truth sooner." They sat in a shared silence after that, the only sound the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. It was an uncomfortable silence, though. It felt like a moment in which both women acknowledged what had been lost and how little could be done to change it now. When Claire left, Evelyn walked her to the door, pressing a small tin of shortbread into her hands. The air outside was sharp and cold, the kind that made her breath cloud in front of her. As she got into her car, Claire glanced back at the house, the lace curtains glowing softly in the fading light. She realized Evelyn's invitation had been less about tea and more about unspoken truths finally finding their way into the open. Claire wasn't looking for more proof, but it had a way of finding her. One afternoon, while she was sorting through a pile of unopened mail on her desk, she came across an envelope from the bank where she and Daniel had once shared an account. It was addressed to both of them, a remnant from when she hadn't yet updated all her personal records after the divorce. Normally, she would have tossed it aside without a glance, but something made her open it. Inside was a generic promotional letter about mortgage rates, nothing unusual, until she noticed a fine print at the bottom, where it listed preferred customer benefits for current account holders. Beneath Daniel's name, there was another, Megan Whitfield. The sight of her best friend's name printed alongside his in an official banking document made her skin prickle. She had never known Megan to bank there. The thought gnawed at her until she decided to call an old acquaintance who worked in real estate downtown. They weren't especially close, but he had always been friendly, and she figured it was worth the risk of an awkward conversation. When she asked, as casually as she could, if he knew anything about Daniel's new place, there was a brief pause on the line. Then he said, "Oh, the loft? Yeah, they signed the lease together a few months back. Corner unit, big windows, high ceilings, one of those renovated warehouse spaces everyone wants. Prime location." Claire thanked him, her voice steady despite the quickening of her pulse. She didn't have to ask who they were. Later that evening, while scrolling through a local business directory online, she saw something else that made her stop. Daniel's name appeared in a list of newly registered companies, a design and consulting firm she had never heard of. Curious, she clicked on the listing, scanning for details. There, in black and white under ownership, were two names, Daniel Foster and Megan Whitfield. She stared at the screen for a long moment, absorbing what it meant. This wasn't just a fling or a post-divorce romance. This was a partnership, legal and financial, a shared investment that tied them together in a way far deeper than she'd anticipated. It wasn't enough for them to be together. They were building something, pooling resources, perhaps even shaping a future Claire had once assumed would be hers and Daniel's to create. Her mind ran back over the past year, recalling all the times Daniel had claimed he couldn't contribute as much to their shared expenses, the vague excuses about tight budgets and unpredictable income. She thought about the small business ideas she had once floated to him, the ones he dismissed as impractical. Now, those same resources were being channeled into something with Megan at his side. Claire closed the laptop and sat back, the weight of it settling in. There was no satisfaction in uncovering the truth, only the dull ache of seeing the full shape of their alliance, the loft, the business, the intertwining of their names in public records. It painted a picture that left no room for doubt about the seriousness of their commitment. She wrote the details down in her notebook, the same one where she'd been recording dates, events, and observations since the beginning. It wasn't about keeping score anymore. It was about creating a map of what had happened, one that made the invisible visible. Outside, the city lights were starting to come on, glowing against the dusky sky. Somewhere, not far from where she sat, Daniel and Megan were unlocking the door to their loft, stepping into a space they had chosen together. She imagined the sound of their voices carrying across exposed brick and polished concrete, the quiet hum of a life in motion. And then she closed her eyes, drawing a slow breath, knowing that each new fact she uncovered was another stitch in a fabric she would never wear but could now see clearly for what it was. The message arrived mid-morning, just as Claire was settling into the quiet rhythm of her day. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and without thinking, she reached for it, expecting a delivery notification or a reminder about an upcoming bill. Instead, Megan's name lit up the screen, a name Claire hadn't seen in her messages for months. The text was short, almost disarmingly casual. "Hey, stranger, want to grab a catch-up coffee sometime this week? My treat." Claire read it twice, then a third time, trying to make sense of the tone. There was no acknowledgement of the months of silence, no mention of Daniel, no hint of apology or explanation, just an invitation, as if the past year hadn't happened, as if nothing stood between them but a busy schedule and the need to reconnect. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She could delete the message, block the number, and save herself in the exhausting mental gymnastics of trying to decode Megan's intentions. But instead, she found herself setting the phone down and walking away, letting the question hang in the air while she made herself a cup of tea. As the kettle hissed, she thought about all the times Megan had texted her in the past, the hurried lunch plans, the late-night confessions, the easy shorthand they'd shared. Those messages had once been small threads in the fabric of their friendship, casual yet deeply familiar. Now, this new text felt like something entirely different. Was Megan reaching out to smooth things over? To explain herself? Or was she so confident in her own version of events that she believed Claire would simply agree to meet without demanding answers? The arrogance of that possibility settled in Claire's chest like a stone. She carried her tea to the kitchen table and stared at the phone again. She imagined the coffee shop Megan might choose, one of the trendy downtown places, maybe even the same cafe where Claire had learned Megan had been bringing her boyfriend for months. She pictured Megan arriving in a carefully chosen outfit, smiling as though the weight of betrayal could be lifted by a well-practiced charm. Part of her was tempted to say yes, to meet and sit across from her in perfect composure, letting Megan talk until she revealed what Claire already knew. Another part of her, the quieter but steadier part, wanted no part in whatever game this was. She didn't need more proof. She didn't need Megan's explanations. She had already pieced together the truth, and no amount of coffee or conversation would make it easier to bear. She picked up the phone and opened the message again, this time noticing the timestamp. It had been sent at 9:03 a.m., deliberate enough to seem casual, early enough to suggest a full day ahead, maybe even a shared morning with Daniel in that loft they now call home. Claire typed a single word in reply, "No," then erased it. She started again, this time writing, "I think it's best if we don't." She read it over twice, making sure it carried no emotion, no trace of the hurt or anger that could be used against her. Then she pressed send. Almost immediately, the typing indicator appeared, a small gray bubble pulsing at the bottom of the screen. But after a few seconds, it disappeared, leaving the conversation blank. Claire waited a moment longer, then locked her phone and set it face down on the table. The tea had gone lukewarm. She took a sip anyway, the bitterness cutting through the lingering taste of the exchange. Outside, the day was moving on, neighbors walking their dogs, cars passing by, the low hum of ordinary life continuing in the background. Claire let the noise fill the space where Megan's voice might have been, feeling the faint, unexpected relief that came with knowing she had chosen not to step back into a room she'd already walked out of for good. Claire surprised herself when she typed the word, "Sure," and hit send. It was as if her fingers had acted before her mind caught up, agreeing to the very thing she had dismissed only days earlier. But the moment the message left her phone, she knew she wasn't agreeing for the sake of reconciliation. This wasn't about forgiveness or even curiosity. It was about control. If Megan wanted to sit across from her, then Claire would make sure the terms belonged entirely to her. She chose a cafe carefully, not the familiar spots they had once favored, but a quiet corner place on the other side of town. It was bright in the mornings, filled with people working on laptops and mothers with strollers, the kind of environment where voices carried just enough to be heard, but not enough to draw attention, public enough to keep tempers in check, impersonal enough that neither of them could claim it as their own territory. The night before the meeting, Claire sat at her kitchen table with her phone in her hands, scrolling through her settings. She tested the voice recorder app twice, once with the phone screen lit and once with it dark. The faint red blinked when it was recording, but when she tucked it into her purse, it disappeared entirely from sight. She tested the audio quality, speaking softly from across the room, and was satisfied when she could hear every word. She told herself it was just for reference, just in case Megan said something that later needed to be remembered word for word. Morning came crisp and clear. Claire dressed deliberately, choosing neutral colors and minimal jewelry, nothing that could be mistaken for an attempt to impress. She wanted to look composed, untouchable. On the drive over, she rehearsed the boundaries in her mind. She wouldn't volunteer information. She wouldn't rise to bait. And she wouldn't give Megan the satisfaction of seeing her unsettled. The cafe was moderately busy when she arrived, the low hum of conversation mixing with the hiss of the espresso machine. She picked a table near the window, placing her purse carefully beside her chair, the recorder already running. Every detail of the setting imprinted itself in her mind. The chipped edge of the table, the way sunlight fell across the floor in long rectangles, the faint scent of cinnamon from the bakery case. Megan arrived 5 minutes late. Walking in with that same confident stride Claire remembered from years of friendship. She wore a fitted camel coat, her hair styled in loose waves, sunglasses pushed up onto her head. For a brief moment, Claire could almost see the woman she used to meet here for casual lunches, the one who knew her secrets and shared her own. But then Megan smiled, and it was a kind of smile that carried too much awareness, too much control over the situation. They exchanged a brief, polite greeting before Megan slid into the seat across from her. The conversation started lightly, almost absurdly so. Comments about the weather, the price of gas, how quickly the year was going. Claire let it play out, giving nothing away. Her responses clipped but civil. She noticed Megan studying her, searching for cracks in her composure. When Megan finally shifted to more personal ground, asking how Claire had been holding up, there was a faint tilt to her voice, a mix of concern, and something that felt like performance. Claire kept her eyes steady, her voice calm, and didn't take the bait to elaborate. She answered with the same kind of non-committal phrases Megan had used to avoid talking about Daniel in the months before everything came out. Minutes passed like that, a slow dance of careful words and polite facades. Beneath the table, Claire's phone remained still in her purse, capturing every syllable, every pause. She wasn't entirely sure yet what she would do with the recording, but just knowing it was there made her feel anchored. By the time Megan shifted in her seat and reached for a coffee, Claire realized she had no intention of letting this meeting become what Megan might hope for, a smoothing over, a rewriting of history. She could feel the balance tilting, not in Megan's favor, and she decided she was fine with letting her wonder how much Claire really knew. The coffee sat between them, cooling slowly as Megan's words began to shift from small talk into the territory Claire had expected all along. It happened almost casually at first. Megan stirred her drink, eyes fixed on the swirling cream as if the pattern might give her courage, and then she let out a soft sigh. "I never meant for it to happen," she said, her voice carrying that careful blend of apology and justification Claire had heard from others in entirely different contexts, the tone of someone who wanted to be forgiven without truly owning what they'd done. Claire didn't move. She kept her hands wrapped loosely around her cup, her gaze steady, as though waiting to see if Megan would go on without prompting. Megan took it as permission to continue. She glanced up briefly, then away again, and her fingers tightened around her spoon. Daniel and I, we didn't plan any of this," she said, the words slow, deliberate, as though she wanted to make sure they landed in a particular order. "It just happened, and we're in love." The phrase hung in the air like a dare. Claire noted how Megan said, "We're in love," not with warmth, but with a firmness that suggested she was trying to make the idea real simply by stating it. There was no softness in her eyes, no flush of someone reliving something beautiful. Only the quiet strain of someone defending a choice she knew would never look good from the outside. Claire took a measured sip of her coffee, giving herself a few seconds to let the words settle. She could feel the old, familiar ache starting to rise. The memory of Megan sitting in her kitchen years ago, laughing at one of Daniel's odd habits, pretending to be the friend who understood everything. Now those memories looked different, reframed by the knowledge that the listening, the empathy, might have been something else entirely. Megan leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping. "I need you to believe me when I say it wasn't about hurting you. I care about you, Claire. I always have. But sometimes you meet someone and..." She trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, as if the ending would be too dangerous to speak aloud. Claire kept her face unreadable. Inside, her thoughts moved quickly, dissecting every word, every pause. Megan wanted understanding, maybe not forgiveness, but the comfort of knowing she hadn't been cast as the villain in Claire's mind. She wanted to control the story, to make it about love rather than betrayal. "Did you?" Claire asked quietly, her tone even. Megan blinked. "Did I what?" "Did you care about me?" Claire said. "When you were meeting him for coffee? When you were in my home, laughing with both of us, knowing what was happening?" Megan's eyes flickered, just for a moment, and then she looked down. "It wasn't like that," she said quickly. "We didn't mean for it to start when it did. And when it did, it was complicated." Claire let the silence stretch between them. She could hear the faint scrape of a chair at another table, the hiss of the espresso machine, the distant hum of traffic outside. In that quiet, Megan's words seemed smaller, less convincing. "Complicated," Claire repeated, her voice neutral. Megan nodded, almost eagerly. "Yes, we couldn't help it. And I know that sounds selfish, but..." She stopped herself, catching the shift in Claire's expression. "I just thought maybe if we could talk, you'd see that this wasn't about betraying you. It was about finding something we didn't expect. Claire didn't respond right away. She took another sip of her coffee, letting the weight of Megan's desperation settle in the space between them. It was clear Megan wasn't here to confess in the hope of repair. She was here to lessen her own guilt, to hand some of it over, and hope Claire would carry it with her. When Claire finally spoke, her words were calm, almost attached. "I see it exactly for what it was," she said. And for the first time in the entire conversation, Megan had no reply. Claire set her cup down with deliberate care, the soft clink of porcelain against wood punctuating the silence between them. Megan was still looking at her, waiting for some flicker of sympathy, some sign that her words had shifted the weight of what she'd done. But Claire's expression remained steady, her voice even when she finally spoke. "I already knew," she said. The words landed with quiet precision, not loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables, but sharp enough to cut through whatever fragile script Megan had been following. Claire watched the change in her face, the way her eyes widened slightly, the way her shoulders stiffened as if bracing for a blow she hadn't expected. "Long before today," Claire continued, "I knew." Megan's lips parted, but no words came at first. She blinked once, then twice, and managed a faint, incredulous "you knew?" as if she needed to hear it again to believe it. Claire nodded. "I saw the signs. The late nights. The way you'd avoid certain topics when we talked. The shift in how Daniel spoke about you, or didn't. And then the pieces started fitting together. I didn't need anyone to spell out for me." Megan sat back slightly. The confidence she had walked in was starting to drain away. She glanced toward the window, then back at Claire, searching for some opening, some way to turn the conversation back in her favor. "If you knew," she said slowly, "why didn't you say anything?" Claire's gaze didn't waver. "Because I wanted to be sure. And because sometimes knowing is its own kind of answer. But here's the thing, Megan. It wasn't a marriage ending that hurt the most. That I could have survived without losing myself. What cut deeper than anything else was you." Her voice was steady, but there was a weight behind the words now, a truth that filled the space between them in a way no apology could. "You were the person I trusted, the one I told everything to. When Daniel was distant, I confided in you. When I had doubts, I turned to you. And all the while, you were part of the reason those doubts existed. That's the part that stays." Megan swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. She looked smaller now, less sure of her footing. I didn't want to hurt you," she said weakly. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in disbelief. "But you did, and it wasn't an accident. Every moment you chose to keep going with him. You made the choice to let me find out in the worst possible way. You let me live in a version of our friendship that wasn't real anymore. That's not something you stumble into. That's something you decide." The cafe noise seemed to fade, the surrounding conversations reduced to a dull background hum. Megan shifted uncomfortably, her gaze falling to the table as if it might offer an escape. Claire leaned back slightly in her chair, not to put distance between them, but to signal that her words were final. "I'm not here because I need answers from you," Claire said. "I've had them for a while now. I'm here because you wanted this meeting, and I wanted you to understand that I'm not in the dark. I know exactly what happened, and I know exactly who you are now." Megan's breath caught, her mouth opening as though to argue, but she closed it again when she saw the unshakable calm in Claire's expression. Whatever she had hoped to gain from this conversation, validation, understanding, the easing of her own guilt, was slipping out of reach. Claire reached for her cup again, taking a slow, measured sip, and when she sat down, she didn't look away. "Losing him," she said quietly, "was nothing compared to losing you. But now I know that I didn't really lose a friend. I lost the idea of one." Megan had no response to that, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything either of them had said. The door to the cafe closed softly behind her, muting the clinking of cups and low murmur of voices until it was just the cool evening air pressing gently against her face. Claire paused for a moment on the sidewalk, letting the night settle around her. The air carried the faint scent of rain from earlier in the day, mixed with a warm drift of roasted coffee from inside. She drew in a slow breath, not because she needed to calm herself, but because she wanted to feel the the shift from the stifled air of that table to the openness of the street. The city moved at its usual pace. Cars sliding past with the occasional hiss of tires on damp asphalt, snippets of conversation spilling from pedestrians who brushed by without noticing her. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the urge to look over her shoulder or scan the faces around her for the one she'd been avoiding. She had sat across from Megan, listened to her twist the story into something palatable, and she had said what needed to be said. There was no grand confrontation, no raised voices, but she realized now that she hadn't needed one. Her feet carried her toward the corner without much thought, the rhythm of her steps matching the quiet hum of the street. She could still picture Megan's face, the momentary flash of uncertainty when Claire told her she'd known all along. That image would linger for a while, she knew, but it didn't feel sharp anymore. It was like a painting you'd taken down from a wall. The outline still faint on the surface, but the weight of frame no longer pulling at the nail. She passed a shop window and caught her own reflection in the glass. For weeks, maybe longer, she had avoided looking too closely, afraid of seeing the tightness in her eyes or the way exhaustion had settled into her features. But tonight, she really looked, and there was something different. Her expression was calm, almost neutral. But beneath it there was a looseness in her jaw, a softness in the way she carried herself. The ache in her chest hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt like something that controlled her every breath. Claire turned down a quieter street, where the glow from the lampposts fell in warm circles on the pavement. The sound of her own footsteps was steady, unhurried. She thought of the months she had spent piecing together the truth, the nights lying awake, wondering how much of her marriage had been real and how much had been a slow erosion she hadn't noticed in time. She thought of friendship that had been her anchor for years, and how it had become the very thing that pulled her under. And now, as she walked, she understood that knowing the full shape of the betrayal had given her something unexpected. Not closure in the tidy, storybook sense, but the freedom to stop asking questions. At the next intersection, she paused for the light, watching as a couple crossed in front of her. They were laughing about something, leaning into each other, their ease untouched by the weight of anything unspoken. For a moment, she let herself remember that kind of simplicity, not with Daniel, but from much earlier in life, before things had layers and fractures. Then the light changed, and she kept walking. The cafe was already several blocks behind her now, and with every step, it felt further away in more ways and distance. The words exchanged at that table would stay where they belonged, sealed in that space. She had no intention of revisiting them, no desire to turn them over in her mind until they lost their sting. By the time she reached her car, the night had deepened, the streetlights casting long shadows across the hood. She opened the door, sliding into the driver's seat, and rested her hands on the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine. The dashboard lights flickered on, casting a soft glow across her face. She felt lighter, not empty, not untouched, but lighter in a way that made the road ahead seem possible again. When she pulled away from the curb, she didn't look back. The house was quiet when Claire stepped inside, the kind of stillness that used to feel heavy but now seemed to have its own calm. She set her keys on the table by the door, shrugged off her coat, and let the low hum of the refrigerator be the only sound in the room. Her shoes made a soft, muted thud as she placed them neatly by the wall. For a moment, she simply stood in the entryway, looking around at the space that was entirely hers now. She walked into the small study and sat down at the desk by the window. The lamplight cast a warm circle across the surface, catching the edge of a thick folder that had sat there for weeks. It was slightly worn at the corners, its weight familiar in her hands as she pulled it closer. She opened it and looked at the contents one last time. Printed screenshots of messages, dates written in her own neat handwriting, a few grainy photos she'd saved from social media. Each piece was a fragment of a timeline she had once felt desperate to complete. Her fingers rested on the top page, but she didn't read the words again. She didn't need to. Every detail was etched into her memory, not because she wanted it there, but because living through it had burned it too deep to forget. The evidence had served its purpose. It had shown her that she wasn't imagining things, that the shifts in her life had roots she hadn't been able to see at first. It had given her clarity when everything else felt blurred. But now its role was over. She thought about shredding it, about erasing every file and photo, so there would be no trace left to stumble upon years from now. Yet something stopped her. This wasn't about holding on to proof for some future confrontation. She had no interest in exposing Daniel or Megan further. They had already done that to themselves in 100 small, careless ways. This was about keeping a record for herself. A quiet, private archive of the moment her life had split into before and after. Closing the folder, she felt the subtle shift of its weight, as if the act itself sealed it in place. She slid it into the bottom drawer of the desk, a space she rarely opened. It wasn't hidden exactly, but it was out of sight. She would keep it not as a weapon, but as a reminder of the months she had spent untangling lies. A reminder of the strength it took to face the truth without letting it hollow her out. A reminder of the kind of life she would never allow herself to be pulled into again. Leaning back in the chair, she glanced toward the window. The street outside was still, lit only by the occasional sweep of headlights from a passing car. The glass reflected her face faintly, and she studied the expression there. It wasn't joy, not exactly, but it was steady. It was the look of someone who had walked through something sharp and come out on the other side with her own boundaries intact. Claire reached for the mug of tea she'd left there earlier, now lukewarm, and took a slow sip. She didn't need to plan her next move. There was no scheme forming in the back of her mind, no urge to see what they were doing now. She had already stepped away from that part of her life, and whatever happened between them was no longer hers to carry. After a while, she turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness, the only light coming from a hallway. As she moved toward her bedroom, she felt the quiet resolve settle deeper, like a foundation she could build on. The folder would stay where it was, untouched, until the day came when even the reminder wasn't necessary. Until then, it would sit there as silent proof, not of what she had lost, but of what she had learned to protect.